welcome to the RDA meeting of whatever today is, February 11th, 2020. And welcome to my vice chair. This is her first RDA meeting, so
thank you so much.
Board Vice Chair Valdemoros.
Thank you.
Bienvenidos.
Gracias.
A couple of things just for staff's awareness. Our monitor thing up there is not working. So council members, all of the information is in your packets to follow along with any presentations. We will pull the presentations up on the computer so that they can be on Facebook Live and some other platform that we use of some sort, SLC TV there. So just as a little brief announcement, general comments to the board? No? Nobody wants to talk to us? Okie dokie. Public hearing on the RDA budget amendment number 2. No? Nobody there either, huh? All right. Moving right along. That brings us to RDA business, item number 1, which is the RDA budget amendment number 2. Danny, do you want to just quickly remind us what this amendment is?
Sure. Given that no one from finance is here to speak to it, I'll do a high-level summary because I think that it's simple enough to where they would agree that this is really more or less just the accounting and budgetary side of what was part of the Block 67 interlocal agreement with the county, as well as a reimbursement agreement with the developer. And so real high level, just you'll recall that we created a project area, Block 67 North, for the purpose of the West Corridor development in Phase 1. As part of that Phase 1 development, the developer received $15 million of county funds. Those funds were processed through the agency, and then as part of our interlocal agreement and reimbursement with the developer, there's a portion of the tax increment from that project area that will go towards reimbursing back to the county. And so we have received those funds from the county. We have also, within the context of the agreements that you approved, processed that payment to the developer as they have met the criteria to receive those funds. And what you have before you in Budget Amendment 2 right now is just the accounting and budgetary side of our own RDA accounts, representing that we have received that revenue and then we have approved the expenditure of it as well. So this is just reflecting our current budget year to show for that transaction.
Great, thank you. Board members have any questions? In that case, I would look for a motion, please. There is a motion sheet in your folders.
Madam Chair, I move the board approve the resolution adopting the proposed second amendment to the annual RDA budget for fiscal year 2019-2020.
All right, I have a motion by Board Member Johnston, a second by Board Member Dugan. Any discussion on this?
Madam Chair,
Yes, Board
I'm going
Member
to
Mono?
I'm going to abstain from voting, given that I haven't been here for any of the discussions.
Okay, sounds great. In that case, all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? So that passes with everyone unanimously, with Board Member Mono abstaining and Board Member Rogers not present. Great. Moving right along. You know how quickly we're moving, Board Member Wharton, so we can get straight to our retreat. Thank you. Next, we have our housing implementation framework. So we have Danny, Allison, and Tammy at the table. I will leave it up to all of y'all to decide who wants to
I was going
walk
to
us through
defer
this.
to Tammy.
I will too.
Go, Tammy, go.
Yield my time.
Great, thank you. So the purpose of this briefing is twofold. First, we have provided a 6-month update on the Funding Our Future sales tax funds that were allocated through the 2019-20 budget. And second, we have provided a draft housing implementation framework that has jointly been developed by the Department of Community and Neighborhoods, the Division of Housing and Neighborhood Development, and RDA. So first we'll start with the 6-month update on the sales tax housing funds. I'm sure you remember during the last budget process, the council and the RDA board transferred $2.59 million in sales tax funding to the RDA for the development of affordable housing, with legislative intent that provided that the funds be transferred on a trial 1-year basis, that the RDA establish a program to be called the Housing Development Trust Fund, and that this approach be evaluated after both 6 months and 1 year to evaluate whether or not it's maximizing community impact and the deployment of housing development funds for the city. And then also additional legislative intent that was provided stated that the RDA needed to deploy the funds in a manner that's consistent with the Housing Trust Fund and the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board as previously administered by hand. So we have done that. We have actually received 3 applications for funding that, if approved, would allocate the entire amount of the budget, the $2.59 million that was transferred to the RDA. The first application actually is the next item on the agenda, and then the other 2 will be reviewed at future board meetings. And in evaluating kind of the deployment of these funds, from the RDA's perspective, it has streamlined the deployment of development for affordable housing for the funds, having a centralized contact in the RDA. However, there could be additional streamlining that could take place. The Housing Trust Fund and the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board traditionally have been evaluating funds on a first-come, first-served basis. So that's how we have been administering the current $2.59 million. But in 2018, the RDA actually switched to a competitive notice of funding availability process to deploy tax increment funds set aside for affordable housing. So currently, the RDA is kind of deploying funds in 2 different ways. From our perspective, there are several benefits to deploying funds through a competitive NOFA, especially considering that the RDA and the city have been receiving more applications for funding than there are funds available. And under that type of scenario, a NOFA process or a competitive process allows you to call out for applications and then accept applications and evaluate the applications against one another. So theoretically, you could rank and tailor, like select applications for funding that meet current housing needs or that meet certain priorities that the council and the board set for affordable housing. So considering that there are these...
Can I interrupt?
Sure.
Sorry. Do you think that if the board were to look at changing that policy, right, so that we did a NOFA instead of a first-come, first-served basis, would, under the Housing Trust Fund, the Housing Development Trust Fund, Housing Trust Development Fund, whatever we've
Housing
called
Development Trust Fund.
would that still go through the Housing Authority?
The Housing Trust Fund Advisory
Yeah, the
Board.
Housing Trust Fund Board. We really need to come up with some other names for these things.
I think that's to be determined. We could set it up a variety of ways. And so actually, in the memo, there are some policy questions that we have for you, which is the board and council interested in consolidating tax increment funds and sales tax funds in the future through a competitive NOFA process, so it's all administered through one competitive, transparent process. We could still call it the Housing Development Trust Fund and deploy the funds through a NOFA. If the board is interested in doing that, we could look at our existing NOFA policy and propose any potential policy revisions based on the larger scope of funding and application than previously the RDA had been administering. So we could come back with potential policy changes. And then kind of a third policy question we have for you all is if you're interested in continuing the sales tax funds to the RDA in this competitive NOFA process, there potentially are revisions that may be needed to the city ordinance, the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board ordinance that establishes the Housing Trust Fund and the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board. So, and keep in mind, this is a little confusing, but the council and the board did allocate $2.59 to the RDA and sales tax funds, but loan administration of the current portfolio, and there are still funds available in the existing Housing Trust Fund that's still under hand. So
I think that's another policy question we need to determine, is if we're going to keep that underhand, or based on the fact that we now sort of have a framework that you guys have been working on for the last 8 months or so, if we want to move that trust fund money into the 2 points, where the 2.6 is, right? I mean, and for sort of, we have two trust funds that we're talking about. One is the Housing Development Trust Fund, and one is the Housing Trust Fund, right? And so it is confusing, but we only allocated 2.6 million over to the Housing Development Trust Fund and left this other trust fund under hand. And so I'm kind of giving a background for some of our new members. So the question sort of is, do we just leave that in hand and they can deploy it the way they were deploying those dollars previously until it's empty, and then we continue with this new model, or do we reallocate it over to the Housing Development Trust Fund for the way that, to be deployed the way that it's being deployed here?
And maybe there's Madam Chair, if I could, there's I think a third option too of allowing the funds to stay in the Housing Trust Fund for the new purposes outlined in this framework. So having the money just be deployed for the programmatic kinds of purposes rather than the development type purposes, but that's just a budget policy choice that you guys can make at some point.
And
Yes, please.
And how much longer is the funds would be in the hand process? Is it years, or is it just, oh, it could be years?
Yeah. How much is in that?
existing, I was going to say, this item is coming to you obviously as the RDA board, but where this conversation is going, you're already seeing that we have representatives from CAN in hand here. I think that if some of these questions you'd like to have answered, we can bring them to the table, because I think you're talking about both sides of the city in terms of that. But as far as the question on the balance, I don't know if we have an understanding of that, but we can certainly provide that and bring that back.
Yes, please. Darren, did you?
Yeah, Madam Chair, is there, for Tammy maybe, is there a categorical difference between the type of applicant or developer project that would apply through hand or through the RDA? They're basically the same, if I understand it correctly, they're basically the same type of projects. Is that correct?
They are, and to give a little bit of background, I believe it was the council and the RDA board's intent to centralize loans for the development of affordable housing under one body, and through this current budget year, on a trial basis, it has been selected to be the RDA.
Mm-hmm.
So right now, the RDA is accepting all of the applications for gap financing loans for affordable housing development. So HAND is still administering, they're accepting monthly and annual payments on the loans and administering existing loans, but any new
But evaluating
loans,
new loans, they're not doing.
yeah, that has been under the
Right.
purview of the RDA.
I have one more question. So HAND used to do it as a first come, first serve basis, like give out the loans, but the RDA does it as a NOFA.
Right.
Like with the
Starting in
NOFA
2018, that's the approach we began to take.
And so, do we know why? Do we know exactly like why? Do you have an answer on like this is the best method? Like this, the first come first serve is not really effective, or yes it was. Like, what's the difference here? Was one more effective than the other?
Yep.
Yeah.
Observation, just over the years, just observations. I think that both have pros and cons, right? I think that what we've seen is that sometimes if it's a first come first serve approach, you may be able to spend more on a given project because, you know, if one is asking for essentially the rest of what's left in your, either if it's the revolving loan fund or the housing trust fund, then you can have all that money freed up. But then that means that, say, project number 2 comes in the door a month later and you've already spent that money and you think, oh, I wish I knew about project number 2 before we spent all that money on project number 1. So I don't know, just in observing, one of the advantages of a kind of NOFA process is that you can evaluate all the projects together and decide which meet your policy goals to the most extent. And it forces the developers to kind of put their best sort of offer out there, their best foot forward. The downside of the NOFA, of course, since there's pros and cons to both, is that it might limit the amount of times during the year that you can let money go, right? So first come, first serve might be more nimble in terms of responding, but it may mean that you can only respond to one project or 2 versus a NOFA approach. So it's kind of up to you guys. I think that the NOFA approach is just a recent one that we've seen. It's more analogous to how the council does CIP, where you look at, 60 applications and maybe you only have enough funds for 10, so you pick the 10 most important projects, or the 10 projects that meet your policy goals the most important. So anyway.
And I believe, Han can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe they have been switching to a more competitive NOFA process with their service programs. Yes.
Well, that's good to know and good to balance.
I think if I may also, I think Han might add as well that traditionally the Housing Trust Fund was made available as somewhat not a last resort type of funding, but if you had a project that suddenly had a gap that needed to be addressed, not truly on an emergency basis, but kind of as the project was getting close to the finish line, that's why their funding was also more first come, first serve, so that they could provide that level of assistance to projects that suddenly just needed a little bit of assistance. So I may be speaking out of turn, but I know when we had conversations about some of their projects of what they have funded, that was the reason that they participated at the time and at the level they did.
And
So
if anybody from Hand wants to come up and correct Danny, I always like to make sure. Actually, I'm getting thumbs up
You
from
might
the
want
back,
to you might
so-
want to open that up to other departments too. So
Dan and then Darren.
Just an education question. The NOFA funds, do they come in once a year, quarterly, or is it just one time every year?
They are recently have been coming from the housing set-aside funds from each project area that are allocated through the annual budget process.
So that's
Once a year.
Once a year.
Okay. All
But
right.
if I can, it's whether the money gets spent too through the NOFA, right? And so last year, was it the 4 million that we put out the NOFA twice for the high opportunity areas, right?
4.5 million. Mhm.
And so we put out a NOFA, we didn't have any responses. The RDA staff came back to the board and said, what do you want to do? Do you want to change the parameters on this? Because we as a board have that ability to say, well, let's look at what we're asking for, and if we're not getting the goal, I think, at least for me, and I think I can speak for other board members, is to get the money out on the streets so that we get housing built, right? And so there was a problem with this money, and we weren't getting any responses, but then we said, well, let's try it again, and so we threw it back out there, and luckily we got some responses. So it's kind of, it comes in at one time, but it can go out at several times.
And that was with the high opportunity funds that were designated for primarily east side of Salt Lake City, where there currently is a lack of affordable housing. We did have, it was 6.2 million available for projects citywide, and with that 6.2 million, we got 24 million worth of applications. So.
Thanks. So my concern with the NOFA process, I like it because I like that it's competitive. My concern is that I think for smaller projects, and I think that as a city we should be supporting large projects and small projects. For smaller projects, they don't happen on a yearly, that month, or even that 6 months. Projects, if there's land available, you kind of have to put things together quickly from a development perspective. So I think some level of revolving fund is appropriate for housing, just given that if we don't, then there's only really going to be large projects that apply for that. And I don't know if that means we keep having two separate things. Maybe they're both administered by the RDA, and things under X number of under $1 million or something like that go through this revolving fund, and anything over $1 million. I don't know what the threshold should be, but to me, I think there needs to be some level of both. Anytime it gets to be a large enough fund, I think that the NOFA process makes sense because it makes it more competitive and transparent. And it's not just, I came in a week before, so I got all the money and it's gone. But for smaller amounts, it seems like there should be some amount set aside that smaller projects can take advantage of throughout the year. Otherwise, we're just not going to be able to serve the smaller projects. And I think it's important that we look at, we have these really small lots in Salt Lake City, and to be able to develop affordable housing on those small lots, you're doing a smaller project, and that might come available, a month after the NOFA was released or completed. So that's my concern, I think.
I think that's valid, and I think to that point, it was something that Danny brought up, is that part of the housing trust fund is that sort of suddenly I find myself in a gap and I want to finish the project. And so I don't disagree that maybe there's a policy question that we as the board can look at of saying what percentage should be in this revolving loan fund or be available at any time-ish, right? Or something like that. And maybe we can turn that back over to RDA to look at some options for us on that. It sounds to me like if we're looking at policy question number one is that maybe what I'm hearing is people sort of like the NOFA process, but there needs to maybe be another option for these concerns, right? So maybe we can come up with some ideas for us.
Yeah, Madam Chair, if I may.
Yeah, please.
Some cities, I believe at San Francisco, they do special targeted NOFAs. So they've actually done one for the acquisition of infill property throughout the city to kind of target those smaller projects. So that's an option, setting aside specific pots of funding for specific policy goals.
Thanks for the update, and I know this is an ongoing process, and we created something new essentially for her recently, and you're trying to figure it out as we go. How clear do you think this is to the public, to developers, to anybody outside of this room? It's a hard question to answer, but give me a real, anybody, give me a real sense about how clear this is for anybody to understand how the city, through the RDA or is offering sort of support.
Well, from my perspective, the RDA, we have attempted, and I think we've succeeded at getting the word out about how our funds, when our funds are available and how they're available through the NOFA or through kind of the emergency gap financing. And I'm not sure how it is from Hans' perspective. I don't know how many calls they're getting, but it does seem to me that developers and community partners are recognizing that it's the RDA that's kind of administering these loans for affordable housing development. But I do think it is a little bit confusing having the two processes, the NOFA and the first come, first serve.
I see the need for a variety of options from the city, as Darren pointed out, and you all have as well. My concern is that we may be creating more complications to get money out the door, essentially. So do folks understand how do you access city resources to finish projects? And I think you're doing as well as anybody can to get the information out as much as we change the rules like this. But that's my concern. I think we need to find out some stability here and make it clear. Otherwise, it's not going to matter how our intentions are. We're not going to get the money out the door in the way we want to. And folks are probably relying on, well, from a developer side, my guess is they're relying on some consistency. Mm-hmm. So when they're planning out multiple projects ahead, how do they plan forward? Unless we have some consistency for them.
And if I could answer that, I think a lot of that comes from this board, both as the board and the city council, addressing the policy questions of how you'd want to see the funding going forward, so that we then, as both RDA and Speaking for Hand, can craft not only the programs behind that, but then also the marketing, the outreach, and providing that clarity to the developers. And so certainly to whatever extent we can identify where we want funding to go and the respective programs that it goes towards, we can then craft that message and make sure we're providing that clarity, because your question is spot on of what we have been hearing from developers is, if I have a project that does X, Y, and Z, what is the appropriate resource that I need to tap into? And so we can do that once we really start having that clarity on how the funding is going to be put out.
And I don't want to be too ambitious, Madam Chair, or Mr. Chair from the council into things. And simplicity is much harder to get to than we think it is sometimes. But I'd love to see us figure out a way to make this as simple and direct as possible.
I 100% agree with you, and I think in part that's why we took the steps we took last year to move that sales tax money over into RDA because of streamlining that process. I don't think we're, as you mentioned, Andrew, I don't think we're all the way there yet, but I know both Hand and RDA have been working hand in hand to come up with this framework that we have here. But as Danny mentioned, I think there are these policy questions that we need to answer. Today's agenda item was sort of the first step of what I believe will be many, hopefully not too many, but many, in answering those policy questions. This was to give our newcomers some background on what was going on, to see what has been happening over the last 8 months or so with HAND and RDA in building this framework, and then for us to really start to delve into the policy questions that were presented by RDA to say, now it's up to us. So this is the first kind of overview. We plan on bringing this back to the agenda for a more in-depth discussion. We didn't really have a lot of time on the agenda today, but wanted to get this out there. And I would encourage board members to set up small groups if you need some background on it, want to meet with, I'm offering your services, but Tammy and Danny, I'm sure that they would be happy to do that so that we can come back and have a fruitful discussion on those policy questions. The other thing that this relates to is the 10% out of the Northwest Quad agreements that we will be eventually one day getting, and the policy that we need to look at there about where that affordable housing is going to go, how it's going to look. And I think kind of delving into some of these questions, how we're going to look at these, if it's going to be a NOFA, if there's a percentage set aside for a revolving loan fund, all those kind of questions need to be answered or at least talked about, and then go from there. So this, I 100% agree with you, Andrew, and this will be on a future, probably a few future agenda items, but kind of wanted to give the overview here. And I probably accidentally hijacked your presentation, Tammy, so if there's more, it's all back to you.
Well, maybe just briefly, apparently the screen is not turned on today. There's an issue with it, but in your packet you should have this chart, and I believe we're broadcasting that on SLC TV. So this basically was a framework that was collaboratively developed by CAN, HAND, and RDA. And just to give you a high-level overview, it kind of memorializes what has already been happening in the city, including HAND as the central resource for citywide housing policy and plans. Also, we would centralize ongoing monitoring of affordable housing compliance under HAND. So loans that are approved through RDA that are moving forward would be monitored on an annual basis for affordability compliance by HAND. And HAND would continue to administer federal grant programs, CDBG, and related programs that also help with the development of affordable housing and affordable housing programs. The big change with the RDA is that the entire housing trust fund would be transferred under the RDA and be kind of wrapped up in the housing development trust fund for continuing administration of existing loans and future loans. And then also through the framework, what is proposed is that on a case-by-case basis, CAN and RDA will evaluate the appropriateness of RDA kind of stepping in and assisting with the redevelopment of some strategic city-owned property where appropriate. So this was a collaborative process between the groups, and it's the framework we're proposing going forward. Another item I'd like to point out is the administration of the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board would remain under HAND. Impact fee exemption would remain under HAND. So this is the framework that we would like to use. If the board supports, we would come back with suggested policy revisions and recommendations to start implementing the framework, and that would include a discussion on the Northwest Quadrant housing funds.
Okay, that's great. I do have a question about the Housing Trust Fund Board administration. I mean, if the applications are coming through RDA, and I'm not trying to like put any spokes in any cogs in the wheel. No, I don't know. I'm trying to come up with an idea. I'm not trying to mess anything up. That's what I was trying to say. But I do have the question: wouldn't it make sense for that to be under RDA, or is it just better where it's at? And I'm only asking for logistics. Sorry.
The Housing Trust Fund Board itself is actually set up by city ordinance, and its purpose and role is more than just administering the Housing Trust Fund proceeds. And so a lot of their roles are actually higher level city housing policy guidelines and advice and consent. And so I think to the extent that you wanted to shift that, which I don't think anyone wants to do, we felt it was more aligned with the city in hand, continuing to oversee the housing plan and policies for the city. And then our part of actually having them approve the funds is just one small piece that they do.
Okay.
So,
And you guys are finding, getting on agendas and doing that when applications come in, that process works just fine, or?
we've only had to do it once. And I mean, as part of their staff and our staff figuring out this new process, we're continuing to work through it, but we've only had to do it once so far. So I'm not sure that's a good sample size for any changes at this point. I think that's more of that. If that's something that is the desire of the board and the council to continue, then that's something that we will continue to tweak at the staff level.
Perfect, yeah.
But the advisory committee for the NOFA funding is the Redevelopment Advisory Committee, not the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board. Am I understanding that incorrectly?
Yeah, so currently, right now, if it's tax increment funds, projects are reviewed, requests are reviewed by the RDA Finance Committee, which includes 2 RAC members. And if it's the sales tax funds, it is reviewed, they're reviewed by the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board.
It does seem like that. Again, they're kind of the same developers, the same projects being reviewed by 2 different boards. It seems like some streamlining could take place there.
I think that would be a policy question for the board and the council. We've kept it that way for now because, again, the $2.59 million was set up on a trial basis, so we didn't want to completely blow the model up for just a trial basis. And so I think as part of the larger conversations on everything else, that could be raised too. Do you want all RDA housing projects going to the Housing Trust Fund Board? Do you want everything going to both? How would we want to structure that? So,
And that's board policy, so you guys have full control over sort of what route those things take.
Can we, Allison, make a note of that policy question so that when we come back for this discussion that we remember to ask that question as well?
Got it.
Yeah, go ahead.
And again, my simple mind, it'd be nice if it was like a flow chart on all this, because I love that we have Trust Fund Advisory Board, Trust Fund Development Fund Board, and this simple mind gets confused. So yeah, spider chart.
Sounds like an engineer mind, actually.
Madam Chair, I know we're running out of time on this item, but I wanted to ask the RDA staff just to kind of a gut feel of, now that both loans are being administered, both applications for both loans are being administered by RDA staff, how much of RDA staff resources is that taking up? Are there enough resources within your staff, or is that all you're doing now? Like what?
Right now, yes. I mean, as Tammy indicated, the first one is coming to you as the next item. We've only had 2 others, so 3 more loan applications at this point is not really going to make or break us. I think as the policy discussion and funding proceeds with the board and the council, if it becomes something where we do have a higher demand on our time, that's something that we could look at and work through and report back to the board on that impact to the extent if we administer.
Okay, but
yeah, right now it's okay. I think the other question is if we take over the rest of the Housing Trust Fund and the loan collections and processing of payments. We don't know the extent of that right now to really understand what that workload may be, but that could be another thing that we come back and discuss. But as of right now, we don't see any problems, and we can take it on as we're doing.
Thank you.
How many people does it take to do these loans? Like right now?
Takes a village.
Takes a village. Like staff members, is it 1, 2, or how many loans?
It's usually 1 or 2. I mean, depending on the project manager it's assigned to, they're usually either doing it themselves or working in collaboration with other team members and processing it. But most of the workload can be contained to just 1, and it's just part of our normal project management and tasks that we take on.
All right, thanks.
It's not outside of the box of what we've been doing or adding any element that we're not already capable of administering.
Great. Thank you so much for all of this work. We look forward to having another discussion in the future. So thank you. Next item is the loan that we were talking about. So the loan to the Diamond Rail Apartments. And I have Allison, Danny, Tammy, and is Tracy here?
Tracy
have
is
her on my
in-
list,
She's
but-
in Minneapolis at a conference, so she's
Well, fine,
basking in
Tracy.
the snow.
Thanks a lot. Just kidding.
All right.
I hope it's cold there. Just kidding.
The presentation should be in your folder, and I'll run through it for the benefit of everyone watching at home. So this is a $1 million loan request from the Housing Development Trust Fund, the 2.59 that we were just talking about. Yes, Housing Development Trust Fund. And the applicant is Diamond Rail Apartments LLC. The partners associated with Diamond Rail Apartments include Give Development as the developer and MLRE LLC as the general partner. And these folks have had extensive experience with affordable housing development in the city and have accessed Salt Lake City funds several times successfully. The project concept is a mixed-use, mixed-income development with 80 residential units. 55 of the units are affordable to 50% AMI and below. And of these affordable units, 11 of the units are actually affordable to 40% AMI and below. And the project would also provide 15 three-bedroom units, which will provide valuable family housing close to the urban core. The project cost is at about $17.3 million. The timeline includes groundbreaking that would happen within the next few weeks. It's pending approval of this loan, essentially. And there's a 14-month construction schedule. The sources of the loan include a primary loan from Rocky Mountain CRC, tax credit equity, and the RDA funds, if approved, would represent about 6% of the total project cost. The location is 300 North and 500 West. The corner there, it would actually replace a current auto mechanic shop, which is a non-conforming use. It is across the rail line from the North Temple Station, so it's right across from several hundred units of luxury rental housing. So it would provide valuable deed-restricted housing in a neighborhood where we're getting a lot of luxury units right across the rail line. The site map is included in your packet. There's surface parking and also podium parking included in the project. There's also a few renderings in your packet. There would be 5 floors of residential over a podium, and the project also includes about 1,300 square feet of commercial space. The developer is hoping to get kind of a neighborhood service use, maybe a restaurant with outdoor seating for the neighborhood. The project also includes several amenities, including a furnished accessible clubhouse, electrical vehicle charging, bike storage, garden beds, dog runs, a picnic area, playground, a bike repair station. And let's look at, there's a few elevations in your packet. And proposed loan terms include, as I stated before, a loan of up to $1 million. The terms were based on the current practices of the Housing Development or Housing Trust Fund. The advisory board had established some standards for their underwriting actually last fall, so we are using those standards. These were actually transmitted to you last November. So it's starting out with a base rate of 3%, and then there's ability to get that interest rate down through various public benefits. So this project qualifies for transit proximity and geographic distribution of affordable housing. So the interest rate would go down to 2.25%. It's a 30-year term, hard repayment, so that means the repayments are guaranteed. They're not soft based on cash flow, they're guaranteed. Payments would beginning the date of project stabilization, which is projected to be August 1st, 2021. We have collateral and guarantees proposed on the project, a second position deed of trust on the property, so that would be behind the primary lender, an unconditional personal guarantee from one of the partners on the project, Andrew Hiller, and unconditional corporate guarantees from BAM Development and Diamond 300 LLC, which are also involved in the ownership structure. These guarantees would run through project stabilization. The full terms that you're considering today are included in your packet attached to the resolution. All of the terms align with the Housing Trust Fund standard terms. There's no waiver from standard policy. And on January 23rd, the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board reviewed the loan request and unanimously recommended approval of the terms as presented in your packet. The developer is behind me in the audience if you have any specific questions on the project, or I'd be happy to answer anything I can.
Board members, questions? Dan?
First question, green space. I'm always concerned is that we're always got buildings, they fill up the whole concrete, got parking and building, but we have nothing green there. And we know we're lacking in green space across the city, and we're always looking for more green space. And how do we get a community garden, something that people see that it's not gray? Is there any thoughts or talks about putting something that actually grows in the project?
I don't want to speak for the developer, but yeah, they could come to the table.
I'm sure it was something you wanted me to answer.
Hi.
My name's Ivan Carroll. I work with Give Development and Diamond Rail Apartments. I completely agree. It's actually one of the things that I bring up as we do projects a lot, because you try to get as much density as you can on a project, obviously from a financial and also from a housing perspective. We had proposed some things. We have humongous park strips in this area. We'd proposed some things that were shot down by zoning. Code doesn't allow us to do too much in the park strips of what we wanted to do. And so we have some within the area, within our lot. To the east of our parcel, there's on the parcel to the east side of it, that's where some of the amenities are going to go. And on the south end, there's going to be some sitting area out in green space and some gardening. Specifically, community garden space is what we would love to have in the park strip in front of the building. And that's what had become difficult. I won't say that zoning wouldn't allow it. It becomes a bit cumbersome, though, with a lot of leases and things that get costly for a project like this to do. And then we own the parcel to the east as well. And our goal is to be able to create something between all these parcels that's more green space. I'm not sure that it would be open to the public necessarily, but the hope is that we could have more green space for the residents in that area.
Thank you. Other questions? Anna?
I have a question. So Give Development has other similar projects in this area, correct?
Yes.
And are there more coming?
As of right now, with what we own in the area, we're not intending on putting any more tax credit projects. It is something that we do, so potentially, but as of right now, there's no plans. We have other plans that we would like to use those parcels for that wouldn't necessarily be deed restricted tax credit housing.
So more or less, how many units total like you're gonna have with the projects that are existing?
Sure.
And now and the background for this is the concentration of certain income levels in certain places of our city. So that's why I want to know how many more or less you have.
Yeah. So as of right now, like I said, we don't have any plans to bring any more tax credit housing, and so we have. With between Project Open is what you're referring to, which is a block north of this. Between the three phases of that project, if somebody wants to do the math for me, we'll have, let's say 154, 22, 176, 256 total apartments that are deed restricted in some way along there. And like Tammy had mentioned, we're right across the tracks from really the most expensive apartments in the city. There's a lot more of that construction that's coming in. So we understand the point, and we agree. We don't want to concentrate any one type anywhere. We're very cognizant of that, and our hope would be that we would have mixed income all over the city, not just in one location.
Thank you.
Darren, and then Andrew, did you have something? And then Chris?
So this does have mixed income,
Yes.
if I'm reading it correctly, right?
Yes.
And then to Anna's point, the geographic distribution, 0.5% reduction, that is because it was deemed that it was next to luxury apartments, or what was the
So that
justification for that?
That was based off of guidelines that the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board had established right before the sales tax funds were transferred to the RDA. And so they had established guidelines for interest rate reductions, and the geographic distribution is tied to, I believe it's any census tract that has a 25% individual poverty rate or below, which is
so
quite high poverty rate
Census
still.
tracts that are
Yeah,
that are lower income are qualify for the geographic distribution.
that have a 25% poverty rate.
Actually
or-
higher.
Higher income.
It's the reverse.
25% poverty rate or lower.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so higher income census tracts qualify for geographic distribution.
Right,
I see.
provided the affordable units would be there.
Right, okay, that makes sense. And then the 3% base rate, is that just always we do 3%, or how do we calculate that?
Yeah, that was based on the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board program guidelines that had recently been established as well.
And
The
that's
RDA
updated
loan,
annually, or
no, I think it's just 3% all the time. The
always?
RDA loan program goes off of the current U.S. Treasury yield, but the Housing Trust
It
Fund
just
was
starts at
going off of
3%.
it starts at 3%.
Okay. Thanks.
And just to flag this is, these are all things that the board, if it chooses to make this a more permanent kind of shift of the RDA administering development funds and hand not, I think the board could set by policy how you want to set those rates, how you want to evaluate those rates. So I think they were just sort of continuing practice just for the year, so.
Andrew?
Thanks again. Question about the parking. How many parking stalls do you have per unit? You have 80 units, and I didn't see how many parking stalls, though.
I think it was a 0.73 parking ratio, right?
Yeah, it's like 74 stalls.
Yeah.
Okay, so below 1 then?
Yeah, it's not quite 1-to-1. It's well above the 1/2 that would be allowed, though.
Do you be allowed to 0.5 per 1?
Yes.
What was the choice in there? Give me a sense of that.
We've actually just kicked off a beta test of an electric vehicle car share at Project Open. We're trying to bring it to an affordable community, and so we're hopeful that things like that will take over. We're right across the tracks from a transit station, so we're hopeful that we can reduce that parking ratio, but we are aware that most people still drive a car now, and so we are trying to stay close to the 1-to-1 on how the site lays out. In our ideal world, we would be at a point where we really don't need that much parking, because I think you would also see more affordable housing being built if you didn't need as much parking. But we're not quite willing to go down to the 1/2 that's allowed, just because we don't want to be a nuisance to our neighbors. We don't want to have issues with tenants. We want to provide what will be used.
Okay.
Thank
Any other things you've done in Project Open that you're doing here as well?
So Project Open was the first kind of case study for can we build all electric buildings in a dense way. And we did that one very much just on let's show developers that you can do it at the same cost without changing anything really weird. And we're taking that a step further. We've done Pamela's Place as a consultant, or nonprofit, I should say, as a consultant for HAME there, has taken that a step further. And Diamond Rail Apartments will take it more to be more efficient systems, but still trying to reduce cost of construction while being all electric and trying to tie it to Rocky Mountain Power subscriber solar, so it's fully electric powered. A lot of the other things we've done just generally, garden areas, things like that, so we'll be repeating some of that. But specifically that we were testing in Open, if the car share works, we'll be moving it over as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Mr. Wharton, and then that's the last comment I'm going to take because we have to get moving.
Yes, thank you. So I just wanted to point out to Councilmember Dugan and other people that might be wondering, there's across the tracks, there is going to be another development there, and as part of that development, they're going to be developing a triangle of green space that's intended to be for neighborhood use, so that'll be nearby. And then I just wanted to ask the developer if in the other Give Project Open, you had you have the store and the community center. Are there going to be any similar amenities in this, or is this one just like on the premises, or is it just this one's just housing units?
So it does have, it's about 1,350 square feet of a retail space that we're preparing to be a food use.
Okay.
So we're preparing it with, grease trap and exhaust and everything that would need food use.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, well, I said I wouldn't take any more comments. It didn't mean I wasn't going to say a comment. Beauty of being the chair. Just kidding. I just want to say that I have toured Project Open. I really appreciate the creativity behind the Give Development ideas and what you guys are doing and trying to do and being green and affordable and, kind of thinking outside the box. So I think I look forward to more projects and seeing what else you're going to come up with. And with that, I would look for a motion.
Madam Chair, I move the board approve the resolution authorizing a loan of up to $1 million for a development located at 535 West 300 North Street.
Second.
All right, I have a motion by Board Member Johnston, a second by Board Member Wharton. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Great, congratulations. Thanks, everyone. Let's see. Any report or announcements from our executive director? Lisa, do you have anything that you want to share with us? On behalf of the mayor, thank you. Report and announcements from Danny.
I do. Just two quick announcements. I'll be brief because I know time is short. First, update on 255 South State. Wanted to let the board know that the Planning Commission approved the developer's request for an additional 60 feet of building height for that north tower. And so that is moving forward. Next steps are they're going to continue to refine their design, working towards building permits. We're going to replat the property as well as they are working on finalizing their costs and financing.
Sorry, Madam Chair, can I ask a quick question on that one?
Yeah, of course.
Who's maintaining that property right now? I went by yesterday and it being overrun by graffiti and other things.
A lot of the graffiti was there previous, but we are currently maintaining it, and so we can certainly take a look at to what extent we can maybe mitigate some of that graffiti if new tagging has appeared. So we will follow up on that.
I know it's moving forward. It sounds like I'm great. It's not looking any better. So the public perception could be pretty bad at this point. Like it's not getting better.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We can follow up on that.
Thanks.
And then our other item, I know both in the capacity of the board and the city council, you have talked extensively about the DI property as an overflow shelter. There's been a tremendous amount of work from multiple city departments to bringing that to fruition, and we certainly appreciate the actions of the board and the administration in doing that. I wanted to give a shout out to our property manager, Jim Sarine, who has taken the bulk of that in terms of doing those improvements to get that to a capacity to function as an overflow shelter. Jim doesn't get the pleasure of sitting here very often, and I think he might be happy about that, but he certainly deserves a lot of credit for what we do in terms of managing our property, and especially as it was a priority to get that going. And so Jim's amazing. So that's all I have.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And please tell Jim thank you from us as well. I know I was there on the welcome to the neighborhood party, and the crews were working, and then I was there the day it was opened, and suddenly it was all done, and it was like 2 days. And so I know that there was a lot of work that was put into that, and it's unbelievable that we really have, as a board and a council, took actions to help save lives this winter, and he deserves a ton of credit. So thank you, and send my thanks.
Will do. That's all we have.
Thank you.
Danny.
Anything from you, Ms. Vice Chair?
Yes. I don't have anything, but thank you so much for the opportunity that we've had the last 2 days with the RDA to meet and to give me information, and I'm excited to go over the RDA 101 book with you at some point and share it with the rest of the board. So I'm excited for this year.
It's just a small pamphlet, so it shouldn't take long.
Right?
Cool, I don't have anything, and with that, I believe there's written briefings that I'm sure everybody read, and if you have questions, Danny can answer them. We do have a consent agenda, so I need a motion. This is setting the date for budget amendment number 3.
Madam Chair, I move to approve the consent agenda.
I need a second.
I'll second it.
Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Great, that date is for March 17th. With that, we're adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
You.
To the cannon room.
Hey.